our audience, I have to say thank you that I'm allowed to interview Dr. Benedikt Frey. I will start with the introduction in German, if you don't matter, and then we follow on with the English interview. And in the end, as we told yesterday, you will summarize in German your findings and your preview for our audience. Yeah? Shall we do it? Okay, let's start. Ich bin sehr froh, heute für die Gesellschaft für Außenpolitik Dr. Benedikt Frey zu interviewen. Er ist ein sehr bekannter Mann. Er ist City Fellow der Oxford-Universität. Vor allem hat er dort leitet er dort das Programm Future of Work, die Zukunft der Arbeit. 2019 ist er auch dem Beirat des Weltwirtschaftsforums in Davos beigetreten, dem Beirat für die globale Zukunft, Global Future Council, genauso wie dem Bretton Woods Committee. Bekannt wurde der Herr Professor durch seine Arbeit The Future of Employment, How Susceptible Are Jobs to Computerization. Sein Modell wurde verwendet von Präsident Obamas Beratergruppe, in seiner wirtschaftlichen Beratergruppe, genauso wie der Bank von England und der Weltbank. Also ist es auch für den BBC eine Art Vorhersagewerkzeug. Nun zu unserem Thema, das war jetzt kurz zum Herrn Professor, nun zu unserem Thema, our economies are in a time of trouble because of the shutdown of the coronavirus, but only because of that. It was even before that experts were expecting a downturn of economy. Also expected are high unemployment rates and a reshaping of the workforce. Productivity and wage growth has been decoupled. Growth rates are in most parts produced by owners of capital. The result of the ongoing technology revolution, digitalization, and globalization are the focus we discuss in this scenario. And according to the ongoing crisis, we discuss its influence on tendency already in action. So my first question to the professor is, which one of the two factors, technology revolution or globalization, has more influence on the reshaping of workforce? What is the connection of these factors and actual reduction of globalization, growth of digitalization due to the crisis? What will the shape be?
Well, it's a very important question, and I think it's a tricky one because globalization and technological change are hard to disentangle. They're very much interconnected. On the one hand, globalization is what allows us to export technology that makes knowledge travel between countries and contributes to technological progress. And on the other hand, globalization has to a large extent actually been enabled by technology, at least in some form. So if you go back to the first industrial revolution, for example, much of the exports from Britain traveled by steamships, and it was the declining price of coal and more energy efficient steam engines that made the first wave of globalization that accompanied the industrial revolution, if you like, was in a large extent driven by steam power. The second wave of globalization that's really seen since the 1990s is quite different in the sense that for the first time in history, Western companies have begun to offshore production to low-wage countries on scale. And that is also really enabled by technological change, which have been completely unfeasible without the internet, without computer technology, information and communication technology, for companies to coordinate production and at distance and really locate production in countries like China. Now, I think the question that you're alluding to is what had been most important in shaping European and American labor markets? And here I think the answer is that it has primarily been technological change. Chinese imports have mainly been an input to production in European economies, and it's even increased in Germany. In the US, on the other hand, it's actually been a substitute in some industries, and particularly textiles, apparels, and so on, where entire industries have been displaced, and many manufacturing towns have suffered as a consequence. But if you look at the sort of geography of this, you see that most jobs that have appeared in the Rust Belt, and the Rust Belt is where most robots were adopted. And China hit America under the belt, if you like. So under the Rust Belt in the American South is where most jobs were displaced Chinese import and competition. So you can distinguish between the two. And I think that overall, the impact of technology has been somewhat greater. The impact of trade has been more concentrated. So it's probably been more severely felt in some communities, but overall technology has been the prime driver of this.
Yeah, thank you. How is technology reshaping this workforce, and what is the difference to the phases of change due to technology inventions in former times?
So this is one of the key questions that I also try to tackle in my recent book, The Technology Trap. So there is this tendency, or we often ask ourselves, is this time different somehow? Haven't we seen job displacement before? And the point I'm trying to make is, well, past episodes of technological change has also been rather different. And what I find is that this more recent episode of automation and computerization most closely resembles the first industrial revolution, where we saw a similar hollowing out of middle income jobs disappearing. We saw wage inequality grow as a consequence. We saw the labor share of income fall, which meant that most growth took the form of capital gains and profits. And we also saw a lot of political polarization and social unrest. And the Luddites, for example, famously rioted against the mechanized factory during the Industrial Revolution. And that particular episode received a lot of attention, but that was only part of a long wave of riots against machinery in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in China, in India, and resistance to mechanization in history was the norm rather than the exception. Now, we haven't seen the same outright resistance to mechanization this time around, but we have seen some changing sentiment. So a new or a fairly recent survey by Pew Research in the United States suggests that 85% of Americans now believe that there should be restrictions on the number of machines businesses should be allowed to implement for automation purposes. And even in China, actually, sentiment is changing. So now during the pandemic, a majority in China also favors restrictions on automation, the study shows. There's some sort of differences across Europe. So in France in particular, there is a lot of machinery anxiety, and workers in general are more keen on blocking the introduction of automation technologies, survey evidence suggests. But obviously people today have very different means of showing their discontent, right? During the first industrial revolution, most people were politically disenfranchised. Property ownership was a requirement for voting. And as a result, people voted with sticks and stones. Today, people can show up at the ballots of the election.
Oh, thank you. That's very interesting. Which stratum or kind of work is concerned the most, do you think?
So in the past, the jobs that have been displaced have tended to be jobs that are intensive in routine rule-based activities that can easily be specified in computer code and therefore readily automated. But what we're seeing now with artificial intelligence is that for the first time in history, machines are becoming able to learn themselves. They can tap in to our experience and in terms of the data trails we leave behind. So if you consider, for example, the introduction of autonomous robots at hospital or autonomous vehicles in coal mines, those are relatively structured environments. So it's fairly straightforward for a computer program to specify in computer code all the sort of potential situations the robot may encounter. So in a hospital, for example, somebody walks in front of the robot, you just program it to stop. in city traffic, it's much, much harder to predict all the situations that you could potentially encounter. And that means that there's no way of doing that in a sort of top-down fashion. And the way we're trying to solve this now is to getting algorithms to predict using very large data sets on humans driving. They're essentially trying to predict what a human driver would have done in any given situation. And that is what's driving much of the advances in automation in recent years. That said, even so, there are a number of domains in which machines are still performing poorly. And one such domain is complex social interactions. And there was a Turing test competition, a sort of chatbot competition a couple of years ago that I think illustrates this. And in these competitions, chatbots try to convince human judges of them being a person. So these judges chat with humans, they chat with chatbots, and by the end of the conversation, they try to distinguish between them. And there was actually one chatbot that managed to convince 30% of human judges of it being a person. But it did so by pretending to be a 13-year-old Russian orphan boy speaking English as a second language with no understanding whatsoever of English culture. And if you think about the variety of much more complex social interactions that we do in our daily jobs, so we try to convince people of something, we try to motivate members of our teams to get things done. There are all sorts of in-person social interactions that are extremely hard to replicate, and that is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. Another domain which is very hard still has to do with creativity. And by that I mean the development of novel ideas and artifacts. And it is absolutely true that there is software that writes classical music, but the way that software essentially works, those algorithms work, is that you essentially feed it a data set, right, with past symphonies. And you may like Mozart, and you label, the symphonies you find good to be the Mozart symphonies. And you may not like Chopin so much, so you label those are not so good. And quite naturally, the program is going to come up with something that sounds quite like Mozart. It's going to be some recombination of those symphonies. We're not going to arrive at Stravinsky or Schoenberg or Robert, because composers and artists and innovators more broadly don't just rely on previous works. We draw on inspiration from all sorts of other domains. And much of this inspiration is always going to be outside the training data sets. So in creative tasks, in truly creative tasks, machines still perform quite badly. And a lot of jobs are still quite intensive in those tasks. Creativity doesn't just relate to creative industries. Journalists, writers, computer programmers, software engineers, all of these jobs require a fair degree of creativity.
So in sum, you can say the advantages of man are connected with the manipulation of the object, of complex social interaction and creativity. These are the 3 points an AI-driven development cannot conquer. Is it true?
Yeah, so the final bottleneck you mentioned relates to complex, to the manipulation of irregular objects and navigation in complex environments. So for example, if you think about your home and all the objects you have in that, yes, you could take pictures of all of them and the machine could distinguish between most of them, but simple things like distinguishing between a really important document or a piece of rubbish lying on the floor, or a pot that holds a plant, or a pot that's dirty and needs to be clean, those are very hard problems to actually identify and explain. And as a result of that, one of the last things that are going to be automated is, unfortunately, the cleaner. So I think that is...
Well, to come back to the actual situation, where do you think artificial intelligence could be helpful for the prediction of a crisis, for the prediction of a crisis like COVID, or for the summarize of a crisis like COVID, or for the solutions for a crisis like COVID. What's the connection to AI, or what could AI, artificial intelligence, role could be in this crisis?
So artificial intelligence typically performs well where there is an abundance of data. And that means that sort of tail events, unlikely events, things that happen quite often, like pandemics, are very hard to predict or foretell using AI. And one sort of key difference between humans and artificial intelligence is that we are enormously data efficient, right? If you have a child, it learns by just a few examples. And it has sort of an entirely different concept on the world. It understands how objects will relate to each other and so on. So I'm afraid that the understanding of artificial intelligence is those domains are still limited. It can still be helpful in diagnosing disease, coming up with vaccines potentially. Artificial intelligence is not quite there yet. But there are certainly cases where it can be helpful in identifying outbreaks using Google search data, people Googling for different type of symptoms. So there are tasks in which it can be helpful, but I think for predicting pandemics, we're not quite there yet. And I think it's a very hard problem indeed. I think the best we can do is to try to be prepared for the next one in general.
Yeah. We go for the workforce now. There are two challenges. On one side, wage inequality grows. On the other side, new types of jobs are created, high-skilled jobs. But in figures, General Motors, IBM, and the old industry in itself employed 10 times more people than the digital giants of today to reach the same income. We come to the result that the technology revolution of these days is not an economic revolution. What does that mean to politicians and their strategies? Could the solution be a granted minimum wage?
Yes, I think it's important to remember, first of all, you're absolutely right that General Motors, Volkswagen, these companies created a lot of middle-class jobs in the early mid-20th century that Facebook and Google haven't. Amazon has actually created a fair amount of jobs, but it's a bit of an outlier in that sense. But what I think is important to remember is that Facebook and many of these tech companies have created more jobs indirectly because these jobs tend to be very highly paid, and the people employed in those companies spend a fairly high share of their income on local services when they go shopping, when they take a taxi, when they go to a restaurant. We're not doing many of those things today because of COVID, but in normal times, they spend a fair amount of their income in the local service economy, and that on average, one job at Facebook could create around 5 new jobs in the local service economies. I think that's important to keep in mind. When it comes to helping people adjust, I think we need to take a broader view of what's going on and what's going wrong in our economies at the moment than looking just at a minimum wage. So minimum wage actually you find in the United States that it boosts in sort of employment, which is contradicts sort of conventional economic theory, where you think that under efficient markets, the minimum wage should actually reduce employments. But this is under efficient markets. And one of the problems is that markets are no longer, it seems, very efficient. So if you go back to the 50s and 60s, for example, if you had companies with high markups in certain industries, those profits would predict entry. So you would see companies coming in and competing away those profits over time. And that is something that Milton Friedman and the Chicago School famously pointed to, and they said, look, we don't have to be too concerned with antitrust and things like that because this has this natural dynamic. But what we're seeing now is actually that, you know, these high profits don't necessarily predict entry any longer. And, you know, there are different explanations for this in different industries, but this is something that is not just, you know, the case in tech industries. It's more true across the board. And I think the reason for that is that, you know, many of these incumbent companies have erected quite high barriers to entry, which makes it hard and costly for startups to enter the market. And that is a huge problem, because when a new industry is created, so let's say the automobile industry was tiny before the days of Henry Ford. Henry Ford sort of created the T model, made it the people's vehicle. It became accessible to most of us. The industry expanded, created a lot of jobs. But at some point, the market saturates. And at some point, you know, you're not going to buy a 10th car. And then, you know, to remain profitable, you have to, you know, become more efficient. You have to cut costs through automation and offshoring, and doing that, you're going to release labor, right? And at some point, when you've done that, well, the best thing you can do is try to erect these barriers to entry and spend your excess profits on lobbying to make sure that, you know, you maintain your position. And that seems to be a lot of that is going on, and that is very harmful to the economy, because it means that the workers that are being replaced through automation, there are fewer new industries and new businesses emerging to replace those jobs that are disappearing. So I think we need to think more carefully also about these barriers to entry. Yes, social welfare systems matter. You know, I think something like a negative income tax along the lines proposed by Friedman could make sense, particularly in the aftermath of this crisis, where many people, you know, have lost their jobs and are going to struggle to get back. You know, having some floor might help. And I think, you know, the process of creative destruction has always been painful. Joseph Schumpeter thought it would result in socialism because people wouldn't put up with it in the long run. And one reason people have put up it is that their lives got better. They found new jobs, they shifted into new industries, and we developed welfare systems to help people who struggled to adjust. And if we don't continue in that spirit, then people are going to say no to the system that has generated this enormous wealth and prosperity for the past 200 years.
Yeah, that's interesting what you say. What do you think about sustainability and the Green Deal for Europe? Do you think this is the direction the offensive innovations take now, that EU establishes a recovery fund?
Well, climate is clearly one of the key challenges of the 21st century. I think we need to take a broad view of it, and there are a number of things that we need to do. So number one, we do need a global carbon tax. I mean, every economist would agree, you know, pollution is an externality, it should be priced, should be a tax on it. And we could use some of those, some of the tax intake to fund and subsidize the development of renewable energy alternatives, which are not really cost efficient yet, but we need a lot more investment to develop those technologies. And I think in the meantime, you know, while we do that, I think nuclear power shouldn't be off the table. Yes, it has downsides, but, you know, relative to the costs brought by global warming, I think those challenges are negligible. And thirdly, what we need to do is that we really need to create a massive technology transfer program to export clean energy at low prices to China, to India, to Africa, to South America, to all of these developing and emerging economies that are going to be responsible for most CO2 emissions going forward. So this is not just about Europe. We're going to need a globally coordinated effort and a global technology transfer program to deal with this in a sustainable way.
Could this be a chance for the world of work?
So clearly, renewable energy is creating new jobs. Solar panel installers, for example, has been one of the fastest growing occupations in recent years. That said, there's also going to be a lot of displacement as we move along, because energy thirsty industries, you know, companies producing cars relying on internal combustion engines, all of that is going to go away. So it also means putting a lot of old jobs at risk, and it is exactly this process of creative destruction that I referred to earlier that is very, very necessary. But it's also going to mean a lot of painful transition, and it's also going to mean, shifts in the economic geography of work, because these new energy industries are not going to appear exactly in the same places that the old industries that they replaced. So some communities are going to suffer from this, and we need to help people adjust. I think, as much geographically as in terms of, reskilling people for new type of jobs. And something that I advocate for in my book, for example, is relocation vouchers. So if, a job disappears in Gelsenkirchen and the new one emerges in Munich, moving from unemployment to a new job can be seen as an investment that requires liquidity upfront in order to get that new job. So there's this case for subsidizing that investment. So I think that is something we need to think about as well.
So mobility is important still, to be flexibility. Yeah. Dear Dr. Frey, now we come to the point where I beg you to give us a summarize in German about your views and a preview for the future. It would be very nice. Thank you. You have German. I know, therefore, you could do it.
I'll do my best. Der technologische Wandel kommt mit, was der Wirtschaftswissenschaftler Josef Schumpeter kreative Zerstörung genannt hat. Wenn neue Industrien und Arbeitsplätze entstehen, werden alte Industrien und Arbeitsplätze zerstört. Und dieser Prozess hat zu enormem Wohlstand über die letzten 200 Jahre geführt. Aber es war auch für viele Menschen, die in alten Industrien gearbeitet haben, keine einfache Umstellung, kein einfacher Prozess. Josef Schumpeter hat selbst geglaubt, dass kreative Zerstörung auf Dauer zu Sozialismus führt, weil die meisten Menschen nicht mithalten können mit was die Schnelligkeit und die disruptive Effekte der Zerstörung, was der Zerstörung betrifft. Und ich glaube, dass ein Grund oder zwei Gründe war, warum die Menschen bis jetzt damit immer noch recht zufrieden waren, ist erstens, wir haben neue und bessere Arbeitsplätze erschaffen und wir haben soziale Systeme, Netzwerke erschaffen, die Menschen helfen, die Arbeitsplätze verlieren, in neue Arbeitsplätze zu finden. Und ohne diese Systeme und ohne diesen Wohlstand auf Dauer wären wir wesentlich ärmer. Und um zu vermeiden, dass wir nicht einen Backlash gegen diese kreative Zerstörung sehen, müssen wir einen Weg finden, den Menschen zu helfen, in den Weg in neue Arbeitsplätze und neue Industrien zu finden.
Danke. Das war Ihr Summary und Ihr Preview für unsere Gesellschaft für Außenpolitik. Ich danke Ihnen sehr herzlich für das Interview und ich hoffe, dass wir in Nach-Corona-Zeiten Sie mal bei uns live begrüßen dürfen zu einer Veranstaltung. Es war sehr interessant und aufschlussreich und ich bedanke mich recht herzlich bei Dr. Benedikt Frey.
Herzlichen Dank, würde mich sehr freuen.
Danke.